I want to welcome our viewers and our listeners to this episode of the Miriam Institute webinar, which is a product of the adjunct community of the Miriam Institute. The adjunct community of the Miriam Institute is a collective of student representatives, either in the final stages of their academic studies or who have recently graduated and just begun their professional endeavors. And there is a high number of individuals within that community who are alumni, Dr. Oren, of our Israel Law and Policy Tour, which is for graduate students pursuing a qualification in law, international relations, media, policy, or politics. That tour brings them to the state of Israel for 10 days. They've had the privilege, many of them, of being addressed by you in the Knesset during your time there in elected office. And we also have alumni of the ISAP tour, the Israel Strategy and Policy Tour, which is a one-of-its-kind tour that brings cadets from the US military academies at West Point for the United States Army and at the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs for 2 days to Auschwitz, and then onwards from Auschwitz and the surrounding areas onto the state of Israel for a 12-day strategy and policy tour. They also had the pleasure of hearing from you. And people can learn more about that via our website. But the way that this is going to run for the purpose of our time together is that I'm going to ask you questions for about 20 to 30 minutes. Dr. Oren, we're then going to roll this over to one of our ILAP alums who's going to ask you questions as a member of the Democratic Party, affiliated with the Democratic Party. Then we will ask for one of our publishing adjuncts to come and interview you for 10 minutes. He's affiliated with the Republican Party. We'll then hear from a cadet from West Point Military Academy, and then we'll hear from a further 2 students or recent graduates who are publishing experts, or publishing adjuncts rather, on the Miriam Institute site. So with all of that having been said, let me ask a very basic question. May I call you Michael for the purpose
Please do me a favor, Benjamin, please.
Thank you. I know you always tell me in privately, but I wanted to ask you publicly. And I also, just before rolling, I want to extend my profound thanks to 3 people. First of all, Rosita Panini, co-founder and COO of the Miriam Institute. Thank you for all you do, Rosita. It was wonderful to see you for a few moments there. Alan Langer, our great and powerful colleague in common. Thank you, Alan, for everything you do as our international coordinator. And also to your colleague, Michael Leslie Myers. She was so gracious and great and wonderful in helping to bring this about. So thank you very, very much to all of those people. With all of that having been said, I want to ask you a question that's a little bit unrelated, if I may, to the subject at hand. The passing of Sheldon Adelson. Now, Sheldon Adelson was one of a handful of what are termed mega donors to political parties, in his case to the Republican Party. He was a major financial backer of President Trump and a major backer of Republican congressional candidates, for example. And he was also a benefactor, a huge benefactor to Zionist causes, someone who I would say gave in terms of historical, if not almost biblical proportions. And his donations to US candidates were in part linked to their support for Zionist causes. So in your words, could you speak to the passing of Sheldon Adelson? I should mention we are not beneficiaries of any support from the Adelson Foundation, but we wholeheartedly recognize their contribution to pro-Israel causes. Can you speak to the passing of Sheldon Adelson as a Republican American patriotic Zionist? And while we all know that that work will continue, administered most likely by Dr. Miriam Adelson, what does his passing mean for the state of Israel and for the diaspora Jewish community? Will another one like him, for example, be produced among the younger generations of American Jewry?
Okay, great question. Benjamin Toke, first of all, thank you for having me. It's good morning here. I don't know what time you're in San Diego. It's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon there.
That's
Good
right.
afternoon.
2 p.m.
Great. Rosita, Alan, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be back with the Miriam Institute. Sheldon, I go back about 20 years with Sheldon. Had many interactions with him on the philanthropic level, on the political level. Sheldon was one of the founders of Birthright, which is the major funder of Birthright, ultimately, which a program which has brought now, I guess, close to 200 world to Israel for a free 10-day trip. I was Israel's representative on the Birthright board and interacted extensively with Sheldon. And I have many great Sheldon stories. Great Sheldon stories. And I won't regale you with them right now, but he was an intensely colorful person, unexpected, out of the box, very out of the box, could be very arrogant. Was appointed ambassador back in 2009. The Israeli press reported that Sheldon Adelson had personally called Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, to insist that I be appointed. They got it a little bit wrong. Sheldon did call Bibi, and he insisted that I not be appointed ambassador. It's easy to get these things wrong on Israeli press. The Israeli press actually apologized to me for that. I can't believe that, but it only took them about 5 years to do that. So we didn't agree on everything politically. His legacy, what can I say? A person who gave immense amounts of money to the state of Israel, to very worthwhile causes that weren't very political. People don't know this, but Sheldon Adelson's outside of his political gilding. His biggest gilding was for a medical foundation, right, which supported research into drug addiction, to cancer care. The Adelson Medical Foundation is vast, about $100 million a year. So he was also involved with that. Sheldon, on one hand, he was instrumental in transforming the U.S.-Israel relationship into an increasingly partisan policy issue. Unfortunately, he gave exclusively to Republican candidates. He gave immensely to Republican candidates, upwards of $100 million to the Trump campaign and Trump inauguration. On the other hand, and he was about Jewish, especially the unity of the Jewish people and the identity which young people, the affinity which young people feel to this state. I don't see any Sheldon Adelson coming up the tubes. There are some young philanthropists who are involved. None of them have the resources at their disposal that he had. I think at the time of his death, he was worth anywhere between $25 and $35 billion. And he gave very generously to that. Kind of irreplaceable in that way. And yet, maybe as we move into the post-Trump period for action, maybe there's a chance for restoring some of the crucial bipartisan support which Israel had enjoyed for at least a generation before that.
Well, thank you very much. At some point, I will follow up with wondering why he implored the Prime Minister not to appoint you ambassador to the United States.
I wasn't sufficiently right-wing for him.
You know what? That's what I rather suspect.
Yeah, not sufficiently right-wing.
Right. Well, yeah. You know, there are so many strings to your bow, Michael, and of course, everybody knows you've held elected office. You've served in Israel's most senior diplomatic post abroad, I would say. You're a combat veteran, a commentator. And in my view, it's only my view, and you're welcome to correct me. I think of you first and foremost as an historian, actually. And as an historian, I'd like you to comment on the scenes that we witnessed on the Capitol in recent days. What do those scenes mean for America? What do those scenes mean for America's alliance with Israel? And can you contextualize your comments, if you would, against the charge that many are making that argue that Israel is likely to now pay a hefty price for the closeness that existed and was cultivated and built upon between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu? That person.
First of all, what did the events of last week mean for Israel? And it's not just for Israel benefit, it's for the entire Middle East, and I believe for the world itself. And it's this: Israel has, since its inception, 1948, has been a part of what we used to call the free world. Remember that antiquated notion, the free world? And that free world was predicated on an American ability and an American will to project power, and sometimes to project substantive power, sometimes massive power abroad, not in the so distant future, distant past. You know, we go back to 2003, the Gulf Wars, in which America sent forces over 500,000 men halfway across the world to fight in the Middle East. That was an America that projected power. I was a young paratrooper in Beirut in 1982 during the siege of Beirut, and we in the Israeli army knew that if Israel got into a scrap in Lebanon that President Reagan would send the Marines to get us out, which is precisely what he did. Today, I don't think the Marines are coming. I think that what we saw in Washington was indicative of a country which is uncertain about how to police itself, is not a country that's going to be in a position to police the rest of the world. I think that beginning with the Obama administration and increasing throughout the Trump administration was an isolationist tendency of withdrawing from world affairs. And, geopolitics, like nature, hates a vacuum. And if the United States is going to pull out, there's going to be other countries, other elements, usually bad actors, they're going to fill that void. It's going to be Russia. In our area, it's going to be Russia. It's going to be Turkey. It's going to be Iran. For a while there, it was ISIS. Elements or parties or countries that are going to take advantage of America's withdrawal. That is not good for Israel. It is not good for our newfound Arab allies. It's not good for the free world. And I understand that. Talk about bipartisanism. I don't think there's any more inclination to go back to the old paradigm of America that does police the world, either among Democrats or Republicans. And I saw it happen in Washington a decade ago. I saw that withdrawal. So we looked upon the events of last week in deep sorrow for our brother, sister democracy was being seriously challenged, but also with trepidation, because we realized that the American on which we had based our security policy for well over a generation, that America is now gone. We don't know if it's coming back. I would be skeptical about whether it will come back to the same degree that we were accustomed to it throughout all those years. And we are moving forward. And I've been actually briefing Israeli decision makers, the intelligence community, the military, since I came back from Washington in 2014, saying, okay, we are now in a new era of American withdrawal. Israel has to understand that we are not the same country we were in 1982, certainly not in 1948 or 56. We are now a strong country. We're generally listed as the 8th most powerful country in the world, little state of Israel. We're not so young anymore at almost 73 years old. We're old in the UN, and we can stand on our own 2 feet. America's going to remain our ultimate ally. No other country is going to share our democratic values. No other country is going to have the strategic alliance which we have, and even share our spiritual ties. Completely unique relationship. But Israel's going to have to learn to stand on its own 2 feet, much more so in the future. The next question had to do with, refresh me. That was all one answer.
Well, what I wanted to ask, I will fragment the question, and I appreciate you allowing me to do so. A lot of people are now suggesting that Israel will pay a hefty price because of the personal, not the state to state, but the personal relationship that existed and then was cultivated and built upon between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump. That's the second part. And the final part is this: how do American voters who are deeply, deeply appreciative of President Trump's Israel-related policies reconcile that appreciation with what they saw up on the Capitol that is so antithetical to their beliefs?
Well, I'm going to speak freely about this. This is a very sensitive and complex issue. On one hand, we had Donald Trump, who was, without question, the most pro-Israel president we have known since 1948. This is a president who not only recognized for the first time Jerusalem as our capital, recognized Israeli sovereignty of the Golan Heights, brought us 4 peace treaties in the Middle East and completely changed this region. I'm sure we're going to talk about that in greater detail. The Abraham nuclear deal, which poses a strategic threat to the state of Israel, threatens every single citizen in this country, as well as every resident of the Middle East, who stood up against delegitimization, who voted with us in the UN. An interesting factoid, Benjamin. A couple of years ago, Nikki Haley convened the Security Council at the UN to discuss Palestinian aggression against Israel. And I was in the Knesset, and I asked my staff to look up what was the last last time this British question against Israel? You want to take a guess when the last time was?
Tell me.
The answer is never. Never. So the first time ever.
Shocking.
Amazing. So we have this president who's doing all of these things for us. And on the other hand, and the majority of Israelis are viewing this president as the person who is saving Israel from existential threats. That same president views something of 80% of that community as a president who is actually posing an existential threat to their way of life, and as a serious threat, as the whistleblower of anti-Semitism, of a person who's is loading the courts with judges who are adverse to the values that are held sacred, that are values that are held sacred by a majority of American Jews. That was the perception. So in an almost impossible bind. And you can't fault the prime minister for expressing his appreciation to Donald Trump, for publicly embracing Donald Trump. Those of you who have a keen sartorial eye may have noticed that with Trump's election back in 2016, his inauguration in 2017, Benjamin Netanyahu started wearing red ties. And I will tell you, as a person who spent a lot of time with him, he did not have a single red tie in his word for Donald Trump. And by the way, now he's weaning himself with the red ties. We've been noticing on television. They've gone, from sort of burgundy to blue in the last week. And during the too many elections we've had, if you went through downtown Tel Aviv, there were huge billboards showing Netanyahu shaking hands with Donald Trump, and the logo read, Bibi in a league of his own. Well, he was in a league of his own with Donald Trump. And that was as Donald Trump was receiving 80%, opposed to the 80% of American Jews in the United States who opposed him. Some nice little symmetry there. It created a great dilemma. Where I do fault the prime minister, where I do fault my own government, is that during this period, he and we did not make a greater effort to reach out to Democrats, to assure them of the paramount importance which we assign to bipartisan support, to maintain lines of communication, because now these Democrats around in other fields, particularly in the strategic and intelligence field, have now returned to office. And while I can speak personally that I know them all personally, I know them politically and personally, I can't really point to anybody else in the country who does. And that's not a healthy situation, particularly as we approach issues like the Iran nuclear deal, which have profound ramifications for the security of this country.
So Dr. Oren, let me ask you a question. I'm going to come into the Iran nuclear deal shortly, but with regard to President-elect Biden, when Barack Obama became president of the United States, his legislative and voting history was very, very light on any number of matters, incidentally, including on the state of Israel. Now, as Joe Biden steps forward to begin his term as the US president, his legislative and voting history could not be more different on any subject, including Israel. It is well known and it's well documented and it's long standing. Now, some people say that a Biden administration will merely be a continuation of an Obama administration. Others say otherwise, arguing that Joe Biden is very much his own man, a committed and informed friend of Israel and a stalwart supporter of the state of Israel. So in your words, you tell us, is Joe Biden a friend, a foe, or ambivalent about the state of Israel and America's relationship with it?
He's a great friend. Not just a friend, he's a great friend. I know Joe Biden very well. During my period in Washington, we're talking about a 2009 and 2 years. Throughout most of that period, Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, and Hillary Clinton, as a matter of policy, basically boycotted my embassy. And so my point of contact with the Obama administration was through Joe Biden. So I rounded up a lot of hours with Biden and got to know him quite well. besides being a terrific guy, he's really is an extraordinary individual. He's one of the few politicians I've ever met who actually enjoys being around people. Most politicians like coming up close and intense with the public. Joe Biden was one of the few politicians I know would walk into a room of 800 people and say, wow, 800 people. I'm going to go meet every single one of these people. Believe me, Obama wasn't like that. Bibi's not like that. Most politicians aren't. He was a great raconteur. Most of his stories begin with the line, "As my father used to tell me." He's got a whole arsenal of these stories. My favorite one is, "As my father used to tell me, never crucify yourself on a cross." Translating that into Hebrew, never crucify yourself on a cross. Joe Biden has a 40-year relationship with the state of Israel. He's very fond of talking about his first meeting with Golda Meir on the eve of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. His supporters many of his supporters, close supporters, have been activists in the pro-Israel community. Every year he had a Rosh Hashanah reception, which I never missed. It was great. And he would always get up there and talk about his love for Israel. So about that, I've no doubt for the Democratic nomination. He, along with Bloomberg, maybe one or two others, was the most outstanding in terms of his support for Israel. Some of them were very critical of the state of Israel. Some of them said that they would use aid as a means of pressuring Israel. Pete Buttigieg, among others, said that they would, certainly Bernie Sanders said that they would use aid as a means of sort of arm twisting Israel. He said absolutely not, no way. And so this is Joe Biden. Having said all that, we're going to have, I would say, nagging policy differences on the Palestinian diplomatic issue, and we will have substantive strategic differences on the Iran issue. How deep those differences will be remains to be seen. I have some rather poignant concerns about it, but it remains to be seen. It is significant that of the staff he's appointed, and yes, they are almost to a man and a woman, former Obama officials. On the level of principals, it also goes down to the deputies, whether it be Wendy Sherman, who's now been appointed Deputy Secretary of State, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, John Feiner, the Deputy National Security Advisor, who was my academic assistant at Yale. I know these people very well. Bill Burns, now the head of the CIA. They are all associated with Iran nuclear deal. And some of them very significantly, Bill Burns negotiated the preliminary agreement on the island of Oman behind our backs, by the way. They lied to us, and the person who lied to us pretty much weekly was Wendy Sherman. So who was sent here to tell us that there's no alternative track. Guess what? There was an alternative track. So this sets the stage. I hope not for a showdown, but for some interesting sparks to fly. Now, having said all that, we all know that Joe Biden is not Donald Trump. Joe Biden is Obama. Obama's foreign policy was deeply influenced by ideology. It was deeply motivated by a desire to interact with the Middle East, to change fundamentally America's relationship with the Middle East, with America's allies in the Middle East, to reconcile with Iran, to bring about a reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians. These were deeply, fervently held positions of Barack Obama. That's why he went to Cairo to give a speech that was 3 times as long as his inaugural speech. He did it only, 4 months after the speech. He didn't visit the state of Israel, if you remember. Very different presidency. And so I think there's a better chance here of engaging the Biden administration than we ever had with the Obama administration. And the Obama administration sought crises with Israel almost from day one in order to change the relationship. Biden's not going to be like that.
So my last question before I turn over to the next interviewer of you, is the Biden administration likely to re-enter the Jcpoa?
the JCPOA. And I would welcome the opportunity to talk about our position and my position on the JCPOA. But and the answer to that is yes. The question is how. I mean, Donald Trump also wanted to negotiate with the Iranians. It's not that either of these presidents were against negotiations. They're both in favor of negotiation. The question is, will President Biden take advantage of the immense leverage which he has inherited from Trump through the sanctions? Will he increase that leverage?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think Dr. Oren's Wi-Fi is a little bit unstable. We're going to have him log right back in. Please bear with us while we remedy that. We'll be back on in just 1 or 2 minutes. Let us communicate with his team. Do stay with us. We're going to be handing it over to our next question momentarily, but I will get a full answer to the question he was in the midst of responding to. So please bear with us.
Okay, we're back.
Okay, Dr. Oren, we're back. Could you begin your answer to that last question again? Your Wi-Fi is a little bit shaky. Your Wi-Fi is a little bit shaky.
Try that again. And we're back.
Okay, your Wi-Fi is a little bit shaky, but I would like you to answer that last question if you can hear me. Can you hear me clearly?
Where did I leave off last here? I hear you fine. Where did you last leave off? Where did I leave off then?
You were just saying that both President Trump and President-elect Biden will have wanted to negotiate. The question is how to renegotiate or re-enter the JCPOA.
Okay, so I hope I'm not repeating what you've heard already. That is that the question is how they're going to negotiate, under what terms, and what would be the goal of the negotiations. The hope under the Trump administration was that they would negotiate a new agreement and that that the United States would jettison the JCPOA. Israel's JCPOA is fundamentally and fatally flawed as an agreement, and any attempt to revive it, even to put lipstick on it, will actually make the danger worse, because it will basically bestow double legitimacy on what is fundamentally a dangerous agreement. What the big question with the Biden administration would be to what degree it will avail itself of the immense leverage on Iran, which has inherited from the Trump administration, and which it can. The Iranians are playing a tough game. They are now enriching uranium some 12 times beyond the limits established by the JCPOA. It's still not the levels that it was in 2015. It's far below that. But they're also increasing the quality of the enrichment to 20%, which is a short step away from weapons grade. And they're moving parts of their nuclear program underground, parts of their intercontinental ballistic system underground. All that is designed to basically arm the administration, in the hope that the president then will say, okay, you Iranians go back to the levels that existed in 2015, and we will lift the sanctions. We'll lift that leverage. Now, I have to base myself on what has been said by spokespeople for the incoming administration. They have said that they will seek to go back to the 2015 levels of enrichment, and they will lift these sanctions, and then the United States will enter into negotiations with Iran to achieve a longer and stronger agreement. I guarantee you I guarantee you with 100% certainty, not 99, not 99.9, 100% certainty, that if that's the case, that there will be no second agreement and the American policy will fail. Okay, that's for certain. So, excuse me, our hope that the administration won't pursue that policy and that they will listen to the millions and millions of people who were ignored when the agreement in 2000 ignored. It's amazing, and who have the most to lose from, and that this time America's allies will not be betrayed as we were betrayed back then, and that we can rebuild trust around this totally central and crucial issue and achieve an agreement which actually meets the security needs of this country and of many, many countries in the Middle East.
Thank you, Dr. Oren. I'm going to ask Alan to now bring on Peter Fishkind. He's going to ask you questions as a Democrat supporter of the State of Israel. Thank you very much, Alan. If you can bring on Peter.
Hi, Peter.
Hi, Ambassador. Thank you so much for being with us today. As Benjamin said, my name is Peter Fishkind. Some background on me: I'm currently an attorney at Proskauer Rose in New York. I'm speaking with you today, as Benjamin mentioned, as an American Zionist and someone who's involved with the local Democratic Party here on Long Island where I live, and also a number of national pro-Israel Jewish organizations. And of course, I'm a longtime supporter of Benjamin and Rosita's work, first while I was in law school with Our Soldiers Speak, and now with the MIRYAM Institute. I actually participated in the ILAP tour during one of my summers in law school where we met with you in the Knesset. I actually still remember the meeting fondly, and in particular, you made mention of your personal meetings with President Obama at the time. And my reaction was how fortunate I was to sit with someone who had sat across from people that impact the things that I care about the most. So all of that's to say, thank you for taking the time to meet with young people, speaking with us today, and going forward, please keep up the good work. So turning now to my questions. My first question for you relates to one of the items that you discussed at the outset of your remarks when discussing what happened in the Capitol last week. You mentioned that both parties have now moved away from this policing the world posture. My question relates to the U.S.'s relationship specifically, but of course, that posture is the overarching factor there. Do you feel that even though today people will raise concerns about the far left in the Democratic Party, I have my concerns about an isolationist right within the Republican ranks, but do you feel that there was a particular golden age of the pro-Israel movement in the United States and the U.S.-Israel relationship? Or do you feel that that's a little bit of a false nostalgia, and that today, in fact, we do have as strong of a relationship as ever?
I think that there were golden periods, and they were periods where, say, a president like Bill Clinton was in the White House, when George Bush was in the White House, and there were certain rules of the game in our relationships that were honored. One of them is the rule of no daylight. What does that mean? We're going to have policy differences. We had policy differences with Bush as we did with Clinton, but the idea was not to sort of air them out publicly so that our enemies would enjoy them. One of the other principles was that no secrets, in the sense that if the United States, if a president of the United States was going to make a major policy announcement that would impact Israel in any way, then Israel would have a chance to look at that policy, to look at say the draft of the speech, and to submit comments about it. Those ancient history, the roadmap of George Bush back in 2002, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon had a chance to look at that roadmap for 2 weeks before it was in public with it. And unfortunately, during the Obama administration, both of these principles were no longer honored. Actually, the president actually made a point in his private talks with American Jewish leaders to say that no, we actually have to put public daylight between us and the United States, between the United States and Israel, because when there's no daylight, Israel doesn't do anything. Israel doesn't move. And historically, it wasn't true. During the Bush administration was the last time Israel actually made it under Prime Minister Olmert. So it wasn't really true historically. And all the major pronouncements of the Obama administration period, from the Cairo speech through X number of other speeches related to the Middle East, Israel, not only did we not get a chance to look at the speech, in many cases we were misled about the substance of the speech. And I know that personally. So that has been restored under the Trump administration. Both of these principles. My hope is that I will maintain them as well, because they are part of they're sort of the two pillars, or one of the two pillars. One of the many pillars of our relationship is that type of no daylight, certainly not publicly, minimizing it to the greatest degree possible, and having that type of intimacy in our relationship where we can disagree, but we can also communicate.
Thank you. So again, referencing some of your discussion with Benjamin, you made mention of the appointments, or at least announced appointments, that Joe Biden's made to his foreign policy team. I follow you on Twitter, and I've seen your comments on both Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan. In sum and substance, you said that Blinken is a true friend of Israel and that you can think of no finer choice. On Sullivan, you said he knows and respects Israel, but were critical of his role in negotiating the Jcpoa. I'm wondering if you could expand a bit more on your takeaways with these announcements. And also, as I mentioned before, from your time in Washington, if you could share some of your personal interactions with these individuals as it relates to their position on Israel.
It is a coincidence. I happen to know all these people. It's I don't know if that's good for Israel, good for me, but it's certainly interesting in terms of the appointments themselves. Let's start with Tony. Okay, so Tony I know quite well, and his stepfather was a noted Holocaust survivor and librettist. He used to talk to me personally about his relationship with the state of Israel and how much it meant to him as an individual. Jake, I know on many levels. I worked with my student at Yale for many years, and I was sort of her mentor. She worked with she was the foreign policy advisor both to two senators. Let's go into it, he was just here about a year ago at a wedding. We met at a wedding, another Yale student of mine, and so he's close to the state of Israel. Bill Burns. I have nothing but the highest regard for him. I think if you look at my book, Ally, all of these people are in the book Ally, and I all have very good thing about Sherman, threw me a goodbye party at the State Department when she left. That doesn't mean, Peter, that we don't have serious concerns. And I say we collectively. I'm not a representative of anybody right now, but I can speak clearly for the state of Israel, for the government of Israel. I think I speak for most of the people in the Middle East, that we don't have concerns about people who were intimately involved with the Iranian nuclear deal. And I can't emphasize this point enough. This was a deal that was made, again, and which is so full of so many fatal flaws that it's irredeemable. It's irredeemable from our perspective. And this is not a political position. It's a purely strategic position. It had all sorts of political ramifications. I'm going to surprise you with a factoid. I spent 2.5 years negotiating the Kotel arrangement between the state of Israel and the reform and conservative movements in the United States. And I'm sure you know about that agreement. And it was distinctly painful for me when Netanyahu and our government that agreement. What is not widely known is the principal reason that Netanyahu withdrew from the agreement was the fact that the majority of American Jews supported the Jcpoa, which he and other government ministers viewed as a betrayal of the state of Israel. The second betrayal of American Jews, of the Jewish people following the Holocaust, as far as he was concerned. That's how deeply held, how painful this whole episode was. And I'm saying this now as someone who opposed his speech in Congress. Nothing ever forgave me for it. I opposed it because I knew the price of it. I understood that he had to say what he had to say, and the substance of the speech was spot on. but I knew it'd be close to a death blow for bipartisan support. And I knew the Democrats, many Democrats would never forget it. Particularly African-American Democrats would never forget it. These are very complex and I think agonizing issues. And so when I say that, I have the highest regard for Jake, I have the highest regard for Bill Burns, for Wendy Sherman's level, on the intellectual level, their involvement with the Iranian nuclear deal is a source of deep concern.
Okay, that's all very interesting and helpful. Benjamin, for timing purposes, do you want to transition?
Yes, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you so very much for asking those questions, and we're very proud to have your affiliation with the Miriam Institute. I'm going to ask for Jeremiah, please, to come on. Michael, Jeremiah will be asking you as an individual who's associated with the Republican Party. He's a recent graduate of the University of Virginia, and he's a publishing adjunct at the Miriam Institute. Jeremiah, you've got 7 minutes with Dr. Oren. Thank you very much.
All right, sir. First of all, Ambassador Oren, it's truly an honor to be speaking with you. First of all, thank you for your extensive military, diplomatic, and academic service to Israel and to the U.S.-Israel relationship. Second of all, my red tie was a gift from my father-in-law and has nothing to do with President Trump's fashion sense. As Benjamin Anthony said, my name is Jeremiah Rosman. I served in the IDF from 2006 to 2009 as an infantryman in the Golani Brigade, where I served in Gaza during Operation Cast Lead. I'm not sure if you remember, but I actually interviewed you in 2016 in the Knesset for my master's thesis on the strategic impact of Iron Dome. I recently completed a PhD in international relations at the University of Virginia, and my doctoral thesis developed a new logic for how a country can bring asymmetric conflict between it and a non-state militant group to an acceptable conclusion. Clearly the topic important for both Israel and the United States. I also taught a course on the Arab-Israeli conflict at UVA, in which I assigned your book on the 6-Day War. For the past 2.5 years, I've been national security analyst at the Association of the U.S. Army, and in a week I'll be starting U.S. Army basic training, and then, God willing, heading to Officer Candidate School to serve this country, the United States, which has provided a safe and opportunity-laden home for me and my family. I hope to branch intelligence and eventually become a foreign area officer. I'm also publishing adjunct at Miriam. I had a couple of questions for you, and I want to start with what I believe to be the most existential one. So President Biden has a history of espousing a relatively risk-averse foreign policy. For instance, he opposed the bin Laden raid and the Obama troop surge in Afghanistan, promoting a smaller footprint approach. An opponent's perception of America's willingness to risk conflict is, in my opinion, a critical component of deterrence, which requires that the enemy perceive, or the opponent, if you will, both capabilities and resolve. So what is the likelihood that Iran sees a Biden administration as resolved enough to deter it from obtaining a nuclear weapon if negotiations fail or fail to curtail its pursuit? That's my question.
I really didn't hear the end of the say. What are the chances that Iran will?
That Iran
We're
will...
having some interference here. I couldn't hear the end of the question.
Yeah, no problem. What is the likelihood that Iran will see a Biden administration as resolved enough to deter Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon if negotiations fail or fail to curtail Iran's pursuit of a nuclear weapon?
The United States puts all options back on the table. Now, during the Obama period, that was the logo, that all options are on the table. Unfortunately, nobody in the Middle East believed it. Matter of fact, the only people who believed it were part of the American public, who were quite understandably tired of war. They had gone through 2 unsuccessful and debilitating wars in the Middle East. They didn't want a third. And so on the basis of that, Obama was able to run a campaign that said the alternative to the deal is war, which was a false dichotomy. The alternative to the deal was a better tougher diplomacy backed by a credible military threat. Without the credible military threat, Iran, at the end of the day, will be able to wait out the administration and be able to out-negotiate the administration. Now, the credible military threat needn't be American force at all, exclusively. It could also be Israeli force. And now we have very well-armed Arab allies. And by beefing up the newfound and emergent anti-Iranian alliance in the Middle East, the United States can help lend credibility to its military. The military option always, Jeremiah, was that the more credible it was, the less chance you'd actually have to use it. And frankly, Iran has no ability currently to make war against the United States. It has air forces from 1979. It doesn't have ground forces. Its missiles cannot yet reach the United States. They will in another decade or less, but right now they can't. And the United States has forces that can strike Iran from 50,000 feet in the air. There's nothing the Iranians can do about it. It doesn't mean that Iran can't launch terrorist attacks. Hey, it launches terrorist attacks all the time. They tried to assassinate me in downtown Washington, D.C. The dangers of that military risk, of military engagement with Iran, first, are very, very small. And even if it happened, the ramifications are minimal for the United States of America currently. And so, I would strongly advocate for the return of that credible military threat. All options, the only way you're going to get to a much, much better deal.
All right, absolutely. I certainly agree with that. I also wanted to say that, as an international relations realist, I believe that the U.S. is best served when its leaders put interests over ideology. And I wanted to praise the Trump administration because I believe that its adherence to these principles in the Middle East did away with some long-held truisms that weren't, particular to even the preceding Obama administration, but the administrations well before that, and long-standing stagnated thinking. And that paved the way for the historic strides that you talk about in terms of a regional alliance and peace and security. And I sincerely hope that the incoming administration doesn't throw out the good with the bad as it develops and applies its own foreign policy. I had one final question for you if I have the time, and it's kind of a shift of gears, but it's a cultural question. How might the reality of the Biden administration impact what appears to be a growing cultural divide between U.S. and Israeli Jews?
Well, it depends on the course of the administration's policies, and it also depends on how Israel handles them as well. Let's take it easy. Let's get off the Iranian issues. The Iranian issue is so combustible. Let's take the issue of the Palestinian peace process. Israel's policies toward Judea and Samaria, the West Bank and Jerusalem. If Israel embarks on a major building spree in these areas, the Biden will condemn it. There's a whole hierarchy of expressions of displeasure in diplomacy, of which condemnation is the harshest. But it was Biden who, in 2010, here condemned an Israeli building project in it wasn't really in East Jerusalem, it was Northeast Jerusalem, condemned. If it comes to a vote in the Security Council, I cannot be entirely sanguine that the Biden administration will veto it. As you know, the Obama administration condemning Israel for its settlement policy. If the Palestinians turn around and come back to the negotiating table, I'm sure the Biden administration, though I don't think its priority is to return the type of involvement that existed under the Obama years, particularly not the involvement of Secretary of State Kerry, but I think that the Biden administration will respond to that by getting involved again and be trying to be an honest broker. And being an honest broker means sometimes using elbow, and we would come to some conflict there. So that will have a majority of American Jewry again. 80% of it is going to be Democratic still. And that those American Jews want to see the state of Israel working in lockstep with their administration. On the Iranian deal, again, I think if the Biden administration moves ahead and restores America's membership in that deal, and a majority of American Jews support that decision, implications that you had with the Kotel arrangement, with Netanyahu pulling out of the Kotel arrangement, in large measure, out of a sense of injustice, of almost type of vengeance against American Jewry. And it will cause significant strains in our.
Thank you, sir. And again, it's been quite an honor to speak to you, and I very much appreciate your responses.
Thank you, Jeremiah. We very much appreciate you asking those questions, and good luck in your military career here in the United States of America. Dr. Oren, every year we bring cadets from the United States Military Academy at West Point for the Israel Strategy and Policy Tour. One of the alumni of that tour is here now, and I'm going to ask him, please. Tyler, would you please ask your question of Dr. Oren? Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Benjamin. First of all, Ambassador, thank you so much for your time. And I know that I speak for everyone when I say that this is an absolute honor to discuss these important issues with you. A little bit about myself. I am a cadet at the United States Military Academy. My name is Tyler Skidmore. I'm a systems and decision sciences major with a foreign area studies minor. And additionally, as Benjamin said, I'm a alum of the Israel Strategy and Policy Tour, where cadets from the United States Military Academy, Air Force Academy, and VMI get to go to Poland and Israel to understand Israeli politics, society, history, and the region at large. And kind of on that note, I'd like to extend a special thanks to Rosita Panini, who is so excellent at bringing those tours together. I swear there's a question in here somewhere. I apologize.
Yeah, it's okay. It's fine.
So kind of shifting towards that, relatively recent Gallup polls have shown that the US population generally supports some form of Palestinian statehood. Now, that's not necessarily, I don't mean to take a side on that issue. That's just a judgment of where the American body politic stands on that issue. So given that, how active do you think the Biden administration will be in trying to mediate or negotiate the Israel-Palestinian conflict, or given a rising Iran and the regional balancing against them, do you think other issues pertaining to that will take precedence?
First of all, thank you, Tyler. Thank you for being with me. Just a personal note, my father passed away last month at the age of almost 96. My dad was a career officer in the US military, landed on Normandy Beach, fought through Europe, participated in the Korean conflict as well. So I grew up on a lot of American military bases, and I had a great honor of visiting West Point. I visited Annapolis too, I hate to tell you, and Quantico, and Leavenworth, and a lot of other different bases. So it was important for me to have that language, because as you know, there's a deep cultural gap between the military and civilian echelons of the United States. Sometimes they don't share a language, and for me to have that language is a very, very important tool. I don't think that the Palestinian issue, the attempt to achieve a two-state solution, at the top of its foreign policy agenda. Again, this administration is going to have its hands full. It's going to have its hands full with economic crisis, with political polarization, perhaps even with violence. It's going to, even on the foreign policy level, the Middle East is not going to top the head of its agenda. It's going to be US, China, US, Russia. It's going to be climate change. It's going to be all these other issues that are going to take precedent. In the Middle East, it'll be Iran. And I expect the administration is going to move fast. I think this administration is under a lot of pressure from the Democratic Party from below. 150 members of Congress a week and a half ago signed a letter to the president-elect saying they expect the United States to move immediately to renew the Iranian nuclear deal, unconditionally, by the way, unconditionally. So he's under pressure. I don't see the same type of pressure about the Palestinian issue. And there are many reasons for this, not the least of which is that there's no Palestinian leadership to actually negotiate with. Just yesterday, President Obama, the Authority, entered the 14th year of his 4-year term. He's not elected. He's corrupt. He's 83 years old and a 2 to 3 pack a day smoker. And there's already fighting in the streets of the West Bank over his succession. And the irony of it is we're going to have to intercede between these rival Palestinian factions that are shooting at one another already. And so there's no one has really plenipotentiary power among the Palestinians. We're coming up to an election. There's no left in the Israel. There's almost no party that supports a two-state solution. And then you have people like me. I'm pretty much a centrist. I support a two-state solution. Ask me if you think it's attainable, and the answer is no way. And for many reasons, not just because Israeli opposition to it, because there is I cannot point to any evidence that Palestinians can adduce over the last 100 years that tells me that they're capable of standing a state. None whatsoever. And they've been offered many times. They actually hold the world's record for a people who has been offered a two-state solution by the British in the 30s, by the UN in the 40s, by the United States repeatedly, 2000, 2001, 2008. They always turned it down. So, and I think there were Palestinians who wanted it, but they were incapable of actually signing on the dotted line because it actually meant peace. And that it's very problematic for them. It goes deep into Palestinian identity. So this is what I Trump, which probably because it bears the name Trump is not going to have much of a future. But I was involved as a consultant in that. And I think it's the first peace plan I've seen that reflects realities on the ground. And I've been involved in this process since the Rabin years in the early 1990s. I was an advisor to Rabin. And I've accompanied this process throughout its course. This is the first program I've seen that actually stands at a snowball's chance in hell of succeed. I'd like to succeed, and I have criticism of the chance of the program as well. I think Biden, as in a public way, will go back to the earlier peace plans, particularly of Clinton, which do not reflect reality, and they are not implementable in any way. They're just not, neither on the Israeli side nor on the Palestinian side. It will satisfy a certain ideological lead on the American side, but it won't help Palestinians and Israelis at all, which is tragic. It's just tragic. And I don't see it moving forward in a significant way. I would be delighted, Tyler, if I was proven wrong.
Well, thank you so much for your frank and honest answer, Ambassador. Again, it's been a real honor. I suspect, Benjamin, we need to keep on schedule.
We do. We have time for 2 more questions, but so much, I just want to thank you, Tyler, and say go Army. And with that, I'm going to ask our penultimate questioner, Jenny Shulkin. Jenny, you have a question for Dr. Oren, please, if you would.
Hi, Ambassador Oren. My name is Jenny Shulkin, and
no, Jenny, we can't hear you.
Can't hear it all. She's muted.
Jenny, you've muted. Sorry.
apologize.
And could you turn up the volume wherever you are? Thank you, Jenny.
Okay, I'll start over. My name is Jenny Shulkin, and I'm a publishing adjunct for the MIRYAM Institute. Since my graduation from Harvard Law School a few years ago, I've worked as both an assistant district attorney in Manhattan and a white-collar criminal defense attorney at Jcpoa & Johnson, LLP in Washington, D.C., which is where I am currently. I actually heard you speak, Ambassador Oren, in 2014 when I was studying abroad at Tel Aviv University as a college student. And I even have a picture with you from that night, but I didn't think that I needed to share it with everyone here today.
More gray hair. Go ahead. Yeah.
It's nice to see you again. With that said, I'm pleased to be here tonight and ask you a question. So perhaps in an effort to distract from chaos within our own country or to gain Jewish votes before the 2020 election, the Trump administration focused a great deal of effort on improving diplomatic relations for Israel. Now we have an incoming president and vice president who will almost certainly prioritize national healing and our domestic public health crisis over non-domestic issues like peace in the Middle East. Given the Biden-Harris administration's domestic priorities, do you think that the new administration has the bandwidth to dive into Israeli-Palestinian issues, or do you expect the change in administration to affect peace efforts in the Middle East? And do you think that Israel can continue building on its recent successes with respect to diplomatic relations?
Great question. I think the administration is going to adopt a policy vis-a-vis the Palestinian issue, the peace process, as do no harm in the medical sense. And that means no major changes on the ground, no large scale, no Palestinian attempt to dissolve the Palestinian Authority, to mount delegitimization and sanctions and boycott efforts. I think that part of the Trump legacy will be preserved. I don't think this administration is going to reverse the decision of recognizing Jerusalem as our capital. I do not know about the Golan Heights. That's a different issue. I think that the administration will reopen the Palestinian embassy in Washington, D.C. that was closed by Trump. I think think that the American consulate in East Jerusalem, which was closed by Trump, but for many years before that, through Democratic and Republican administrations, served as a de facto American embassy to the Palestinians. That consulate in East Jerusalem. I think the administration will renew aid to Palestinian agencies, particularly to UNRWA, the refugee agency. I think it's a big mistake, but they'll do it in accordance with the restrictions of the Act, which prohibits the United States from aiding the Palestinians if they continue to provide salaries to terrorists who have killed Jews who are sitting in Israeli jails. Okay, and that's named after a graduate of West Point who was killed by a Palestinian terrorist here. By the way, right down the street from where I'm talking to you, Taylor Force. That'll change, but unless there's a breakthrough on the ground here, as I mentioned earlier, if the Palestinian leadership comes up tomorrow, we want to, and we're waiting for the United States to help us with these negotiations, I think that the attitude toward the peace process will be passive. This is in marked contrast to the position toward the Iranian issue, which would be very, very active indeed, very proactive. And so I think that is what's going to happen over the next few years. I had the honor of escorting Vice President-elect Harris here. She's also astoundingly very really distinctly pro and in favor of is committed to the relationship, committed to the strategic alliance, to Israel's security. I mean, from Israel's perspective, we couldn't get a better team than this. We couldn't. But they are Democrats, and we have policy differences with the party, not just with these individuals, really. And what can I say? I'm not going to get involved in internal American politics too much, but if I had to choose the best possible team, this is probably it.
Great. Thank you so much, Ambassador Oren.
Thank you, Dr. Oren. And for our last guest question, we've got Grant Newman. Grant, I'd like to ask you please to pose your question to Ambassador Oren.
Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Rosita. And thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your time and for your willingness to indulge one final question. As Benjamin mentioned, my name is Grant Newman. I am an attorney here in New York City. I also graduated from Harvard Law School, where I was involved with the Alliance for Israel, and I was a member of the Federalist Society, to give away my political prejudice. And I am proud to say that in 2019, I participated in the Miriam Institute's Israel Law and Policy Tour, and am currently an adjunct for the Miriam Institute. Earlier in your remarks, you mentioned a vacuum perhaps opening up in the Middle East as the United States retreats into its own domestic issues. And I'm wondering if here at the conclusion of your remarks, you could maybe expound upon that thought. Specifically, how do you see regional players such as Russia and Turkey reacting to the new administration's potential Middle East policy? What opportunities, if any, do you see in Russo-Israeli relations moving forward? And perhaps what threats do you see from the Kremlin expanding its influence in the Middle East? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Grant. As I mentioned earlier, geopolitics like nature hates it's filled. We saw it happen in Syria. The United States pulled out. Who came in? The Turks came in. The Russians are there. The Iranians are there. And we did our best to bomb them out of there. We've done a pretty good job of that, but it's far from complete. And the American withdrawal is a sort of a two-edged sword. I wish it's not so black and white. What are the two edges? On one hand, yes, the region fills up with problematic actors, and I can't say that the Russian armies are frenemies. Russia has one of its largest Russian diasporas in the world in this country. 1 out of every 7 Israelis speaks Russian, including many people in this building. A big chunk of the people in Knesset speak Russian. I go on Russian media all the time here. Thriving Russian culture and media here. That's a strong connection with Russia. We have strong trade relations, but Russia is allied in Syria with the Assad regime, which is an enemy of the state of Israel. It is allied with Iran. As the Prime Minister's deputy, I undertook a number of diplomatic missions abroad, sometimes to the Baltic states, which are close allies of the state of Israel. And they would complain that they had the Russian army, 200 kilometers away. And I'd say, what are you guys kidding? I got the Russian army 20 meters away on the other side of the line, the Golan Heights. And that complicates the issue greatly, especially since we have to operate in that airspace and on the ground there. And last thing we want is to run with the right forces, and we've come close times. So that is very complicated. Turkey is not a friendly country. It is not. Erdogan backs Islamic extremists like Hamas. He trains Hamas. And we have to be very, very wary of the Turkish incursions into Syria and other areas of the Middle East. ISIS, of course, but Iran. So there you have that side of the sword. The other side of the sword is the common awareness of the strategic ramifications of America's release is what is animated and impelled to a large measure the Abraham Accords. Why are these Sunni Arab states closing ranks around the state of Israel? Because first of all, they realize Israel's not their enemy, Israel's their ally, but because Israel is also the only serious military power that's capable of standing up to all these challenges, both the Shiite challenges and the radical Sunni challenges. And in the absence of a strong American military presence here, we're the only show in town. And that is one of the reasons I am fairly confident there'll be additional Arab states which will adhere to these accords, because it's in their strategic interest, it's certainly in their economic interest, to wed their economies with the most innovative state in the world. It's quite a confluence, but it's pure strategic self-interest, and it is in no small measure animated by America's strategic withdrawal.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oren. We're supposed to finish this at 3:15 Pacific time, so that gives me just a couple of minutes. I want to ask you one last quick question.
Please.
I think it's probably on the minds of everybody. Who's going to win the election in Israel? Is Bibi to be coronated once again, or are we going to see a real stiff challenge? Does he have a pathway towards forming another coalition? If so, what's the likely composition of that?
So if you ask the pundits, I've been dealing with pundits for many, many years. I'll never forget in 2015, 2016, my first years in Knesset, the Israeli political reporters would come into my office and say, I guarantee you 100% this is the last year of Bibi's term in office. This is the last year. Okay, that was 4 or 5 years ago. And I don't know how many elections, I've lost count. It's like 3, 4 elections ago. If you look at the numbers right now, Bibi doesn't have the numbers. And those who do have the numbers is the anti-Bibi camp. And back in 2016, I made a good call. I called in March of 2016, before Donald Trump had actually won even the Republican nomination. I remember hosting the Republican Jewish Committee, National Committee in Knesset, and informing its members that Donald Trump would be the next president of the United States. And they all moaned, I got to tell you, at that time. They didn't believe it. And I explained that from my perspective, I'm not a prophet, that the elections of the United States were not between left and right anymore, Republicans and Democrats, but between establishment and establishment. That Donald Trump was the most anti-establishment candidate, and Hillary Clinton was the most establishment candidate. So it was sort of a no-brainer. The same thing is occurring in Israel today. It is not between left and right. There really isn't many left. It's between the anti-Bibi camp and the Bibi camp. And that has been the issue for many elections now, but has come to the fore almost exclusively. No one's even talking about policies anymore. It's only about Bibi. And the anti-Bibi camp is attacking him from the right. He's always been attacked from the left, and he's able to say to the Israeli public, hey, look, these leftists are going to give away, Judea and Samaria. They're going to give up Jerusalem. He can't say it about these parties anymore because they're actually to the right of him. And Bibi actually doesn't do many rightist things. He makes a lot of rightist noise, but he doesn't do many rightist things. So these people want to annex Judea and Samaria. They want to have massive building in this areas. And there's one or two small leftist parties who on any given day could play extreme rightists, but they will for a year in order just to get rid of Bibi. And they have the numbers. They could put together a coalition. So if you ask the pundits today who's going to win, they're going to say that this is the last months of Bibi's rule. One thing I've learned in politics, Benjamin, certainly over the last decade, it is always premature to eulogize Benjamin Netanyahu politically. That he always comes back, and he's probably got tricks up his sleeves. He's going to divide. He's going to try to do it with the anti-Bibi camp, and to drive wedges between them, and to try to entice at least one or two of these parties to join the Likud and his coalition. And he's going to come into these elections with a great accomplishment on following up the Abraham Accords. It is the fact that Israel will be the first country on the planet to be completely vaccinated. Out of 194 countries, we're number one. And I got to tell you, I'm going for my second vaccination this week. It is done with clockwork precision. It is amazing to watch what we've done here. And this is, much credit is owed to Israel's healthcare system, which is a world leader, but also the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu is a powerful figure. And when the CEO of Pfizer or the CEO of Moderna get a call from Bibi, they're going to take the phone call. They just are. And he was able to use his to bring in millions and millions of these vaccines. As of tonight, we have no shortage. And you compare this to what's going on, throughout much, if not almost all of the United States, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. So he's going to come to that election. He's timed it just right. The elections are in March. He has now established March 15th as the day in which the last Israeli will be vaccinated.
Well, Michael, thank you so very much for your time. You could not have been more gracious with it. Thank you for pushing through with some of the technical difficulties you were having. That's not always the easiest thing to do, but I'm very appreciative on behalf of my colleague Rosita, our great powerful colleague Alan Langer, and of course our adjunct community. Thank you to all of them for asking you their questions, and thank you for your candid responses. There's so much that I took away from that, including the question mark you raised over the Golan Heights and the information you gave about Netanyahu's withdrawal from the Kotel deal. I had never heard that before. I want to thank you very much for really important information and certainly not out there per what you said. But most importantly, thank you. Thank you for continuing to inspire us. Thank you for continuing to commit to the future of the State of Israel and its relationship with the United States of America. And thank you for serving as a paradigmatic example of what can be done when a member of the Jewish people puts the best of their bodies, their intellects, and their passions towards the uplifting of the Jewish state. Thank you so much. And thank you
all, guys.
All the very
best. Good night. Good morning from Israel.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.